The federal agent's name was Thomas Riley, and he had been working organized crime cases in New York for 11 years, and in all of that time he had never had a source this good. The man across the table from him in the small room on the 4th floor of the federal building on Foley Square had been inside Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson's organization for longer than Riley had been in law enforcement, and the information he was providing was precise and verifiable and connected in ways that suggested genuine access rather than the kind of peripheral knowledge that most informants offered. Riley had built cases on worse material. He had never built one on better. What Riley did not know, could not have known, and would not understand until 3 years later, when the full shape of what had happened became visible in retrospect, was that the man across the table from him was not betraying Bumpy Johnson. He was working for him, and 12 feet away, behind a wall that shared a ventilation duct with the interview room, Bumpy Johnson sat in a utility closet on a folding chair and listened to every word. To understand how this was possible, you need to go back 11 years, to the summer of 1942, and to a man named Walter Briggs. Walter Briggs had come to Bumpy's organization the way most people came to it in those years, through the particular gravity of a man who was known in Harlem to be both fair and exacting, who paid what he promised, who remembered what he was told, and whose reputation for protecting the people who worked for him was specific enough that it attracted men who valued protection over simply the highest available wage. Briggs was 26 years old in 1942, recently discharged from the army with a shoulder that would never fully recover from what had happened to it at a training accident in Georgia, and looking for work in a city that had a complicated relationship with men who came back from the war marked in ways that weren't visible enough to generate sympathy but significant enough to limit what they could do. He had been introduced to Bumpy through a cousin who worked in one of Bumpy's legitimate businesses, a laundromat on 125th Street that served as both a functioning laundry and a reasonably efficient mechanism for moving money between accounts in ways that the IRS found difficult to trace. The introduction was informal, the kind that happened every week in that world, and most of them led nowhere. This one led somewhere because Bumpy, who interviewed everyone personally before making any decision about them, asked Briggs a single question after 40 minutes of conversation and heard an answer that told him something unusual. The question was what Briggs was good at. Most men, in Bumpy's experience, answered this question with the thing they had done most recently or the thing they most wanted to be known for. Briggs answered it with something different. He said he was good at being in rooms without people noticing him, and at remembering everything he heard while he was there. Bumpy looked at him for a moment. Then he said that this was an unusual thing for a man to know about himself, and asked how he had learned it. Briggs said that he had grown up in a household where it was safer to be invisible than visible, and that he had become very good at invisible over a period of about 15 years, and that the skill had turned out to be transferable to other contexts. He said it without self-pity, in the flat voice of a man describing a technical competency rather than a difficult history. And this quality of description told Bumpy something important about the kind of intelligence he was dealing with, the kind that had processed its own experience into usable information rather than into grievance or performance. Bumpy hired him that week, and over the following 11 years, Walter Briggs became something that Bumpy's organization had never formally had before, but that Bumpy had understood the need. For since the earliest days of building anything that required protecting, he became the person who sat in rooms and heard things and remembered them and brought them back in a form that was useful. Not a spy exactly. The word implied a specific kind of institutional loyalty that didn't quite fit. Not an informant, not an operative, not any of the words that law enforcement used for the roles that served similar functions on their side of the equation. Briggs was, in the most accurate language available, a listener. He was extraordinarily good at it. In 11 years, he had never once been made in a room he wasn't supposed to be in. Never once had his account of a conversation disputed by anyone who had been in the room to verify it. And never once brought back information that turned out to be wrong in any material way. Bumpy trusted him with things he trusted no one else with, and this trust was not given carelessly or maintained without examination. He tested Briggs regularly, the way careful men test the things they rely on, introducing small inconsistencies into information he gave Briggs to see how they were reported back, occasionally sending him into situations where the temptation to embellish or simplify would have been understandable, and watching to see whether the report that came back was honest or convenient. In 11 years, the reports were always honest, even when honesty was more complicated than convenience. And this consistency was itself a form of information that Bumpy factored into everything he asked of Briggs and everything he told him. By 1953, Walter Briggs was the most trusted person in Bumpy Johnson's organization. Not the most powerful, not the most visible, not the one whose name was known in the various circles where Bumpy's operation was discussed and assessed. The most trusted. These are different things, and Bumpy had always understood the difference. The federal investigation that would eventually produce the meeting on Foley Square had been building since early 1952, when a new task force assembled by the U.S. Attorney's Office began looking at organized crime operations in Harlem with a specificity and a resource allocation that suggested someone in Washington had decided that Harlem warranted serious attention. The task force was led by an assistant U.S. attorney named David Hartwell, who was thorough, methodical, and possessed of the particular tenacity that comes from having grown up in circumstances that required it. Hartwell had been building the case from the outside in, starting with the most visible elements of Bumpy's operation and working toward the center, accumulating evidence with the patience of a man who understood that the cases that held up in court were the ones that had been built slowly, and that the cases that collapsed in court were almost always the ones that had been built fast. He was, in the assessment of the people in Bumpy's organization who monitored such things, a more formidable opponent than the task forces that had preceded him. Not because he had better resources, but because he had better instincts about how to use the resources he had. Previous investigations had tried to build cases from the financial records outward, which produced evidence that was technically solid but structurally incomplete, because the financial architecture of Bumpy's operation had been designed specifically to withstand that approach. Hartwell was approaching it differently. He was building from relationships outward, mapping the human connections within the organization before he tried to map the money, on the theory that understanding how people trusted each other would eventually tell him more about how the money moved than the money's own trail could. This was, Bumpy understood when his sources described it, both the correct approach and the most dangerous one he had faced. Correct because it was the approach that could, in theory, actually penetrate the organization's real structure rather than its visible surface. Dangerous because it was the approach that required an inside voice, and the search for an inside voice was the thing that Bumpy's entire counter-strategy was designed to anticipate and redirect. Bumpy had known about Hartwell's task force for 6 months before Hartwell had his first real piece of evidence, because Bumpy had spent 20 years cultivating the kind of relationships throughout the institutions of New York that made it very difficult for those institutions to point themselves in his direction without him knowing about it. The specific information about the task force had come from 2 different sources, neither of whom knew about the other, And the fact that both sources produced consistent accounts was itself reassurance that the information was reliable. What the two sources told him was more than simply that an investigation existed. They told him the shape of it, what Hartwell was looking for, what he already had, what his theory of the case was, and most importantly, what he needed that he didn't yet have. What Hartwell needed, both sources confirmed, was an inside voice. He had external evidence in sufficient quantity to cause problems. He did not yet have the corroborating testimony of someone inside. Bumpy's operation that would allow him to connect the external evidence to Bumpy personally in the specific way that federal prosecutions required. He was, in other words, looking for an informant. Bumpy sat with this information for 3 weeks. He was not alarmed by it, because being alarmed by things he had anticipated was not how he processed information. He was interested in it, because it told him something about the shape of what was coming, and therefore about the shape of what was possible in response. And what was possible, he began to understand over those 3 weeks of consideration, was something considerably more sophisticated than simply tightening his organization's security and waiting for Hartwell to exhaust his resources without finding what he was looking for. What was possible was giving Hartwell exactly what he was looking for, in exactly the form he was looking for it, while controlling every element of what that informant said. He called Walter Briggs into his office on a Thursday afternoon and told him what he was considering. Not a proposal, not an order, a conversation, because what he was asking Briggs to consider was not something he would or could compel. Briggs listened to the entire thing without speaking, which was his characteristic mode of receiving information, and when Bumpy finished, he sat for a long moment before he responded. He asked one question. He asked why Bumpy was telling him rather than simply arranging it without his knowledge. Because, Bumpy said, this only works if you understand it completely. An informant who doesn't fully understand what he's doing makes mistakes that an informant who understands makes differently, and the differences matter in this case more than they would in most. Briggs nodded. Then he asked what understanding it completely meant, in practical terms. Bumpy told him. He was precise and detailed and left nothing vague that could be made specific, because the plan he was describing would fail if any element of it was improvised rather than prepared. He told Briggs what information he would provide to the federal investigators. He told him what form it would take, not what words to use, because rehearsed words sound rehearsed and investigators are trained to hear the difference, but what categories of information and what level of detail within each category. He told him what the federal investigators would do with the information. Based on what Bumpy's sources had told him about Hartwell's theory of the case, and how those actions would affect the investigation's direction. And he told him what the end result would look like if everything went as planned. The end result, if everything went as planned, was that Hartwell's task force would spend the next 18 months pursuing a version of Bumpy's organization that was accurate in its external details and systematically misleading in its internal structure, a version that pointed toward 2 of Bumpy's associates as the primary operational figures, associates who were, in fact, genuine members of the organization, but who occupied positions of considerably less significance than the version Briggs would ascribe to the federal investigators would suggest. The investigation would build toward those 2 men, accumulate evidence about their activities, and ultimately produce indictments that were legally sound and factually accurate as far as they went, while leaving the actual architecture of what Bumpy had built entirely untouched. Briggs asked the obvious question. He asked what happened to the 2 associates. Bumpy told him the 2 men, their names were Curtis Fielding and Raymond Pope, had both been informed of the plan in the same conversation that Briggs was now having. Not in the same room, but on the same afternoon, and both had agreed. They had agreed because Bumpy had been honest with them about what they would face, because the charges they would face were for activities they had genuinely engaged in and could not be characterized as manufactured, and because Bumpy had made specific and detailed commitments about what their cooperation would mean for them in terms of legal representation, financial support for their families during any period of incarceration, and their positions within the organization upon their return. These commitments were not vague reassurances. They were specific, documented in the way that Bumpy documented things that mattered, and they had been delivered with the particular quality of certainty that came from 11 years of never once failing to do what he said he would do. Fielding and Pope had heard those commitments, and they had assessed them against their experience of Bumpy Johnson, and they had agreed. This was, Bumpy told Briggs, the part of the plan that required the most trust. Not trust in him, though that was also required, but trust in the idea that a plan this complex, involving this many people with this much at stake, could hold together over 18 months without something going wrong in a way that couldn't be managed. Briggs considered this for a long time. Then he said that in his experience, plans failed when people didn't understand them or when they stopped believing in them, and that in this case the people involved understood it, and that whether they would continue to believe in it over 18 months was a function of whether the commitments were honored, and that honoring commitments over time was something Bumpy had a documented record of doing. So the question, Briggs said, is whether you believe the plan is sound. Bumpy said he believed the plan was sound. Then I'll do it, Briggs said. The approach to the federal investigators was handled with the same care as everything else. Briggs did not walk into a federal building and announce his availability. The approach was made through an intermediary, a lawyer named Gerald Sachs, who had legitimate connections to both worlds and who was trusted by both sides to deliver a message accurately, and it was framed in the particular language that investigators expected from a genuine informant, which was the language of someone who had reached a personal limit and needed a way out, not the language of someone making a calculated business decision, which was the accurate description but not the one that would produce the desired result. The investigators bit. They bit the way careful investigators bite when they've been waiting for exactly this, with controlled enthusiasm, the professional version of the feeling that arrives when something you've been working toward finally comes within reach. Riley, who was assigned to develop the relationship, met with Briggs 3 times in locations that Briggs suggested, which were locations that Bumpy had selected for reasons that had nothing to do with convenience and everything to do with the specific quality of their acoustics and the specific configuration of their adjacent spaces. On the 4th meeting, the location was the room on the 4th floor of the federal building on Foley Square. This was the investigator's choice, not Briggs's. And it had happened because Riley had decided that the relationship had developed to the point where moving into an official setting would produce better evidence and better documentation. This was the correct investigative judgment, the kind that Riley's 11 years of experience had taught him to make and that would have served well in almost any other circumstance. What Riley had not accounted for was that the federal building's 4th floor had been renovated in 1949, and that the renovation had been contracted through a company that had, among its subcontractors, an electrical firm whose owner had a relationship with Bumpy Johnson's organization that predated the renovation by several years, and that this relationship had resulted in the installation of a ventilation system whose configuration on the 4th floor included a utility closet adjacent to the primary interview room that shared a duct, in a way that the building's original architects had not intended, and that the renovation's general contractor had not thought to examine. The duct's configuration was not obvious from either side. On the interview room's side, the vent cover was standard issue, identical to every other vent cover on the 4th floor, positioned at ceiling height where no one looked unless they had reason to. On the utility closet side, the duct opened behind a shelf unit that the janitorial staff had positioned there years earlier and never moved. The sound transmission was not perfect. There was a slight ambient hiss from the building's ventilation system that ran beneath everything, but voices at normal conversational volume were entirely comprehensible. And Bumpy had tested this personally, alone, on a Saturday morning 2 weeks before the meeting, sitting in the utility closet with a radio playing in the interview room next door and recording that the lyrics were audible word for word. Bumpy had known about this configuration for 4 years. He had never expected to use it. When the 4th meeting was confirmed for Foley Square, he understood that he was going to. He arrived at the federal building at 6:30 in the morning, before any of the investigators, accompanied by a man who worked for a company that provided janitorial services to the building and who had worked for that company and quietly for Bumpy's interests for 3 years. The utility closet was accessed with a key that the janitorial company's staff routinely carried. A folding chair was placed inside. At 7:45, Bumpy Johnson settled into it and waited. The meeting began at 9. What Bumpy heard over the following 3 hours was both exactly what he expected and more than he had anticipated, because hearing a plan execute itself in real time is different from designing it, and the difference was instructive. Briggs was extraordinary. Not in the dramatic way that the word extraordinary was usually applied, not with visible technique or evident effort. He was extraordinary in the way that genuine mastery is extraordinary. It disappeared into the work, leaving only the work itself, and the work was flawless. He answered questions with the specific texture of a man accessing memory rather than reciting preparation. He expressed uncertainty where uncertainty was appropriate and precision where precision was expected. He corrected himself twice on minor details, which was exactly the kind of thing that genuine informants did and that rehearsed informants failed to reproduce because it required the specific confidence of someone who was telling the truth and knew that a small correction strengthened rather than undermined his credibility. He paused in the right places and he spoke without hesitation in the right places, and he displayed at 2 moments in the conversation when Riley pressed him on details that approached the boundary of what Bumpy had decided he should provide, exactly the right degree of resistance. Not enough to suggest he was hiding something significant. Enough to suggest that the information beyond that boundary was real, and that he was choosing not to share it. From the utility closet, Bumpy listened and made notes in the small notebook he had brought. Not because he needed to remember what was being said, but because writing while listening was how he processed complex information. And this was complex in the way that all genuinely important things were complex, which was not in their surface content, but in the spaces between their elements. He noted 3 things that deviated from the plan he and Briggs had prepared. None of them were significant. 2 were adaptations to questions that Riley asked in forms that the preparation had not anticipated. And Briggs's adaptations were the adaptations that Bumpy himself would have made in the same position, which confirmed something he had already known about Briggs's judgment. The 3rd was a detail that Briggs volunteered that had not been discussed. A small, specific, accurate fact about the timing of a particular financial transaction, and Bumpy understood, hearing it, that Briggs had added it because the conversation had reached a point where the absence of that detail would have created a gap that a careful investigator would notice, and that providing it was the right call, and that Briggs had made the call without hesitation. By noon, When the meeting concluded and Briggs was escorted out of the building by Riley with the particular warmth that law enforcement extends to sources they believe are genuinely valuable, Bumpy was already gone. He was sitting in a restaurant 2 blocks away, having coffee, when his phone rang. It was Briggs. He said 4 words. It went as planned. Bumpy said he knew, and that they would talk that evening, and hung up. What followed over the next 18 months was the most extended and most precisely managed operation that Bumpy had ever constructed. And it worked in the particular way that plans work when they are built on accurate information and executed by people who understand them completely. Hartwell's task force moved in the direction that Briggs's information had pointed, which was the correct direction in terms of external evidence, but the wrong direction in terms of the internal architecture of what they were trying to understand. They built a case against Curtis Fielding and Raymond Pope that was legally sound and factually accurate within its own frame of reference. They obtained additional corroboration from sources that they had developed independently of Briggs. Sources that confirmed what Briggs had told them about Fielding and Pope's activities. Because what Briggs had told them about Fielding and Pope's activities was true. It was simply incomplete in ways that additional sources couldn't fill. In March of 1955, Fielding and Pope were indicted on federal charges related to their actual activities in Bumpy's organization. The indictment was solid. Both men were represented by a legal team that had been arranged and funded in the manner that Bumpy had committed to 18 months earlier, and that legal team did precisely what good legal teams do with solid indictments. They identified every procedural vulnerability, challenged every piece of evidence that could be challenged, and ultimately secured outcomes that were significantly less severe than what the indictment's original scope had suggested. Fielding served 14 months. Pope served 11. Both men returned to Harlem to find that the commitments made to them had been honored, with the same precision as every other commitment Bumpy had ever made. And both of them returned to positions in the organization that reflected an understanding of what they had done that went beyond the official narrative, and that neither of them ever discussed in any way that could be documented. Fielding served 14 months. Pope served 11. Both men returned to Harlem to find that the commitments made to them had been honored, with the same precision as every other commitment Bumpy had ever made. And both of them returned to positions in the organization that reflected an understanding of what they had done that went beyond the official narrative, and that neither of them ever discussed in any way that could be documented. Hartwell's task force was disbanded in the spring of 1955. Its resources redirected to other priorities by a U.S. attorney's office that had decided the Harlem investigation had produced what it was going to produce. In internal assessments that were filed and eventually became accessible through later disclosure requests, the task force's performance was characterized as solid work that had achieved results within the limits of the available evidence. Hartwell himself was identified as a capable prosecutor whose methodical approach had built a clean case. The limitation, the assessments noted, was that the investigation had not penetrated deeply enough into the organization's leadership structure to address what the task force's original mandate had described as the primary objective. Hartwell himself was identified as a capable prosecutor whose methodical approach had built a clean case. The limitation, the assessments noted, was that the investigation had not penetrated deeply enough into the organization's leadership structure to address what the task force's original mandate had described as the primary objective. This limitation was noted but not elaborated upon. No one writing those assessments knew why the penetration had not been deeper, because no one writing those assessments knew what they hadn't found. Riley retired from federal law enforcement in 1961 in a conversation that he had with a colleague shortly before his retirement. He mentioned the Harlem case as one that he thought about periodically, not because it had gone wrong exactly, but because something about it had never quite resolved in his mind the way cases usually resolved. He said that Walter Briggs had been the best source he had ever worked with, precise, consistent, apparently motivated by genuine disillusionment, and unfailingly accurate in everything he provided. He said that he had never found a reason to doubt Briggs's information, and that the case it had built had held up in court. What he couldn't explain, and what continued to trouble him in a quiet way, was why someone with Briggs's apparent access hadn't been able to give him more, why the information had been so good in its specific domain and so consistently limited at its edges, why every question that approached the center of the organization had produced the same quality of thoughtful, honest-seeming resistance. He said he had always wondered whether he had been managed. He said he had never been able to prove it. His colleague asked him what he would have done differently if he had known. Riley thought about this for a while. Then he said he didn't know, because what he had been given was real, and real was usually the best you got in this work. And the question of whether real was being managed from a level you couldn't see was a question that didn't have a practical answer. Walter Briggs retired from Bumpy's organization in 1962, when a combination of age and the shoulder that had never fully recovered from Georgia made the work he did increasingly difficult to do at the level he held himself to. He retired with the specific acknowledgement that such retirements received in that world, not public, not documented, but understood and honored in the ways that mattered to the people involved. He moved to a house in New Jersey that he had purchased through the accumulated savings of 20 years of work that had paid precisely what it promised. He had a garden. He read in the evenings. He did not talk about what he had done, not because he had been asked not to, but because talking about it had never been his. Nature and the years had not changed that. Bumpy visited him once, in the spring of 1964, 4 years before his death. They sat in the garden for an afternoon and talked about things that had nothing to do with the work Briggs's shoulder. A book Bumpy was reading, the neighborhood around Briggs's house, which was quieter than either of them had been accustomed to for most of their lives. At some point in the afternoon, Briggs mentioned, without particular emphasis, that he had heard Riley had retired. Bumpy said he had heard the same. There was a pause of the comfortable kind that develops between people who have spent many years in each other's company and have nothing left to prove about their ability to be in the same space without filling it. Briggs asked whether Bumpy thought Riley had ever figured it out. Bumpy said he thought Riley had suspected something but hadn't been able to name it. Briggs nodded. "That's the right outcome," he said. "Not fooled. Just unable to prove." Bumpy agreed that this was the right outcome. Then he said something that Briggs would think about for the rest of his life. Not because it was profound exactly, but because it was the most direct statement he had ever heard. Bumpy made about the philosophy that had governed his approach to everything he had built. He said that the ideal result of any operation was not that your opponent didn't see you. It was that your opponent saw exactly what you showed him, understood it correctly within its own frame, and never had reason to ask whether the frame itself was the thing you'd designed. Briggs said he thought that was probably the definition of most things, not just operations. Bumpy said he thought that was probably right. They sat until the light changed and Bumpy's car was waiting at the curb. And then they said goodbye in the manner of men who have known each other across a significant portion of their lives and understand that the knowing is durable enough to survive the ending of the professional context that produced it. Bumpy's car pulled away from the curb and moved through the quiet New Jersey street toward the highway, and Walter Briggs went back inside his house, and the afternoon settled into evening in the garden where they had been sitting. In the federal building on Foley Square, the utility closet on the fourth floor continued to exist unremarked through subsequent renovations and reorganizations. Of the building's fourth floor, the ventilation duct that connected it to the adjacent interview room was eventually sealed. During a renovation in 1971, by which point the events that had made its configuration significant had been over 16 years, and no one involved in the renovation had any reason to know that the duct had ever been anything other than a routine feature of an unremarkable building's infrastructure. The folding chair that Bumpy had brought to the closet on a Tuesday morning in 1953 was taken out with him when he left. It was an ordinary folding chair, the kind available in any hardware store in the city, and it continued to serve various unremarkable purposes in the years after that morning, unaware of where it had been and what had happened around it. The notebook in which Bumpy had made notes during the 3 hours of the meeting was kept, as most of his notebooks were kept, in a manner that preserved their contents but prevented their circulation. The 3 deviations from the plan that he had noted were discussed with Briggs that evening in a conversation that Briggs later described, and the only oblique reference he ever made to any of this as one of the most useful professional conversations he had ever had, not because the deviations had been problematic, but because the discussion of them had produced a clearer understanding of the principles that had generated them. Hartwell went on to a distinguished career that included several successful prosecutions of organized crime figures in the decade following the Harlem investigation. He never revisited the Harlem case formally, though colleagues from that period reported that he occasionally mentioned it in conversations about the difficulty of building cases that penetrated organizations' actual leadership structures rather than their visible operations. He is reported to have said, on at least 2 occasions, that the Harlem investigation had taught him something important about the difference between evidence and understanding. He did not elaborate on this distinction in ways that were recorded, and what he meant by it remained his own private conclusion about a case that had produced results within its official scope and left something unresolved at its edges that he carried with him for the rest of his career. The something that he carried was this: the knowledge that he had been close to something, that the information he had received was real and the case it had built was real, and that real was not the same as complete, and that the difference between real and complete was the space where the most interesting things happened and the hardest questions lived. He never answered those questions. He came to accept, over time, that not answering them was probably the answer, in the way that the absence of evidence is sometimes the most significant evidence available. Bumpy Johnson died in 1968 in a fried chicken restaurant in Harlem, of heart failure, in a manner that was so ordinary as to seem almost impossible given the extraordinary nature of everything that had preceded it. He was 62 years old. He had outlived most of the men who had tried to destroy him and a significant number of the men who had tried to understand him. Walter Briggs learned of his death from a newspaper, sitting in his garden in New Jersey on a morning in late July. He read the obituary twice. Then he folded the paper and set it on the table beside his coffee and sat for a while in the particular stillness of a man who has just received information that closes something. He did not talk about Bumpy Johnson to anyone after that morning, not to his wife, not to his neighbors, not to anyone who came to visit. He lived another 11 years in the quiet house in New Jersey, and when he died, at 73, peacefully, in his own bed. The specific knowledge he carried about a Tuesday morning in 1953, and a utility closet on the 4th floor of a federal building, and 3 hours of listening through a ventilation duct went with him, as he had always intended it to. Some things are kept not because they are secret, but because they belong to the people who experienced them, and the experience was sufficient, and the keeping is its own form of honor. That was enough. For both of them, across all of it, that had always been enough.